A first-class passenger is ridiculed by a flight attendant, ordered to move to economy, and humiliated in front of other travelers. But what the flight attendant doesn't know, she's talking to the CEO of the airline. The quiet hum of first class filled the cabin as passengers settled into their plush leather seats, sipping champagne and adjusting their travel pillows. Everything seemed normal, until one flight attendant made a terrible mistake. She strode toward a woman seated by the window, her expression tight, her voice laced with irritation. "Ma'am, first class is reserved for premium passengers," she said coldly, looking the woman up and down. "Economy is in the back." The woman didn't flinch. She simply met the attendant's gaze with an unreadable expression. Passengers nearby turned their heads, sensing the tension. Some smirked, enjoying the unfolding drama. Others simply watched in quiet discomfort. What the flight attendant didn't know? She wasn't speaking to just any passenger. She was talking to the CEO of the airline. You won't believe what happens when the truth is revealed. What did the flight attendant say? And what shocking consequences await? Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more eye-opening real-life stories. This isn't just about one flight, it's about racism, power, and the consequences of underestimating the wrong person. A successful Black woman faces blatant discrimination in a space she owns, but the outcome is one no one saw coming. Olivia Carter remained seated, her expression calm despite the humiliating remark from the flight attendant. She had been through this before, being questioned, doubted, and underestimated in spaces she rightfully belonged to. But this time, the irony was almost amusing. She wasn't just any first-class passenger. She was the CEO of Skylux Airlines, the very company operating this flight. Yet, here she was, being told she didn't belong. A self-made entrepreneur, Olivia had built Skylux Airlines from the ground up, turning it into one of the fastest-growing luxury airline brands in the world. She had worked tirelessly, breaking barriers in an industry where Black women in leadership were still a rarity. Despite her success, bias still followed her, even at 30,000 feet. Today, she had chosen to fly anonymously, dressed not in a power suit, but in a beige cashmere sweater and designer slacks. Stylish, but understated. Her long, dark hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, and her minimal makeup only enhanced her natural beauty. She carried herself with quiet confidence, never feeling the need to prove herself to anyone. Until now. Standing in front of her, with an air of authority, was Sarah Collins, a senior flight attendant who had worked for Skylux for nearly 2 decades. Sarah was known for her strict demeanor, sharp eye for detail, and a sense of entitlement that often went unchecked. At first glance, she was the perfect flight attendant. Her uniform was crisp, her blonde hair neatly tied back, and not a single wrinkle or scuff visible on her polished appearance. But beneath the surface, Sarah had a habit of making snap judgments about passengers. In her world, first-class passengers fit a certain mold. Wealthy, well-dressed, and, though she would never say it out loud, usually white. Olivia, in her mind, did not fit the profile. She had made up her mind the moment Olivia boarded the flight, and now she had the audacity to try and correct what she assumed was a mistake. The cabin itself was a picture of luxury. Plush leather seats, gold-accented tray tables, and the faint aroma of fresh coffee and citrus hung in the air. The mood was relaxed. Passengers scrolled through their phones, sipped drinks, or exchanged polite conversation. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, offering pre-departure champagne and warm towels. Soft jazz played in the background, adding to the exclusivity of the first-class experience. As Olivia had walked onto the plane earlier, she had noticed the subtle reactions from the crew. A few attendants had given her a once-over, their expressions unreadable, some merely curious, others dismissive. She had seen it before. The lingering glances, the subtle hesitation in their greetings. It was the same old game. Assumptions, made based on appearances. Sarah, however, was different. She wasn't just silently judging, she was acting on it. And now, standing over Olivia with a firm stance and a disapproving frown, she was making it clear that she didn't believe Olivia belonged here. What Sarah didn't know was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Sarah stood in the aisle, arms crossed, scanning the first-class cabin as she made her way down the row of plush seats. Her gaze landed on Olivia, and immediately she hesitated. Something about this passenger seemed off. No designer handbag, no extravagant jewelry, no assistant fussing over travel details. Just a woman in a soft beige sweater, seated comfortably, flipping through a magazine. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. First class wasn't just about money, it was about appearance, status. This woman didn't fit the mold. She was too casual, too unassuming. The uniformed flight attendant inhaled sharply, straightened her posture, and marched over. Sarah stopped beside Olivia's seat and cleared her throat. Her voice was firm, clipped, designed to establish dominance. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this area is for first-class passengers only." Olivia barely glanced up from her magazine. Her face betrayed no surprise, no outrage, only quiet composure. She held Sarah's gaze for a moment before replying in a calm, even tone. "I know." Sarah blinked. The response was simple, confident, but she wasn't convinced. Something about this woman's demeanor irritated her. She wasn't acting flustered, embarrassed, or confused. Most people, when caught sneaking into a section they didn't belong in, would at least try to explain themselves. But this woman, she was too comfortable, too sure. Sarah's tone hardened. She leaned in slightly, making sure the passenger understood she wasn't playing games. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." Her voice was louder this time, deliberately carrying across the cabin. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension. One businessman smirked, clearly entertained. A woman in the adjacent seat sighed, shaking her head. Without a word, Olivia reached into her purse and retrieved her boarding pass. She didn't argue, didn't protest, just handed it over. Sarah snatched it quickly, flipping it over, inspecting every detail. Her lips pressed into a thin line. It looked legitimate, but still she had doubts. Her eyes flickered between the ticket and Olivia. Something wasn't adding up. "Ma'am," Sarah said, her tone softening just slightly as if trying to be patient, "you might have gotten upgraded by mistake. Economy is towards the back." A few people gasped quietly. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Olivia noticed the subtle changes in the atmosphere, the amused glances, the disapproving whispers, the way the businessman chuckled under his breath. This wasn't just about checking a ticket anymore. This was about proving something. Olivia remained silent for a few seconds, letting the tension sit, letting Sarah feel the weight of what she had just said. Then she leaned back in her seat slightly, tilting her head. "Are you done?" Sarah's nostrils flared. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Usually, people who didn't belong in first class tried to argue, made excuses, or panicked. This woman, she looked bored. Sarah straightened her shoulders. She wasn't going to let this slide. "I need to check with my supervisor." Her voice was sharp, clipped, carrying through the cabin like an announcement. She turned on her heel and stormed toward the front of the plane, gripping the boarding pass like it was evidence in a crime scene. As she disappeared behind the curtain leading to the flight crew area, the whispers in the cabin grew louder. A few passengers exchanged knowing glances. Others simply sat in awkward silence, pretending not to notice. Olivia exhaled slowly. She wasn't humiliated, but she was tired. Tired of moments like these. Tired of assumptions. Tired of having to prove, again and again, that she belonged. But this time, the truth would do all the talking. Sarah marched toward the front of the plane, her grip on Olivia's boarding pass tightening as she approached the crew area. She was certain of what was about to happen. Her supervisor would back her up, the passenger would be escorted out of first class, and order would be restored. Moments later, she returned with her supervisor in tow, her expression triumphant. She walked with purpose, her head held high, believing she was about to remove an unworthy passenger from first class. But Olivia, she hadn't moved. She sat in the same position, calm and composed, her magazine resting on the armrest beside her. Her presence alone was defiance. The supervisor, a middle-aged man named James Porter, took the boarding pass from Sarah and reviewed it carefully. His forehead creased slightly as he read the details. He hesitated. Sarah noticed. She didn't like it. "We need to be firm with these things," she blurted, her voice sharp. "People try to sneak into first class all the time." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "These things?" she repeated, her voice quiet but laced with steel. "For the first time," Sarah faltered. A few passengers turned their heads, sensing the shift in tone. The businessman who had chuckled earlier stopped smirking. The woman who had sighed in frustration leaned forward slightly, watching closely. The confrontation was no longer about a seat assignment. It had become something else entirely. "I'm just following procedure," Sarah said quickly, her voice firm, but the confidence behind it was beginning to waver. Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Procedure?" she echoed. Then she asked, "Tell me, what exactly about me made you question my seat?" Sarah's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The air between them grew heavy. The entire first-class cabin was listening now. Passengers had stopped pretending not to pay attention. A few exchanged glances, waiting for Sarah's response. Sarah fumbled. I just wanted to verify." A woman across the aisle spoke up, breaking the silence. "I saw what happened," she said, her voice clear. "This is ridiculous." Sarah's face flushed red. Her once unwavering stance was starting to crack. The businessman shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less amused. Others in the cabin nodded in agreement, whispering among themselves. James, the supervisor, cleared his throat and turned back to Olivia. "Ma'am, But before he could continue, another figure entered the cabin. The flight manager had arrived, a tall, polished woman in a navy blue uniform, her badge gleaming under the cabin lights. She approached with an air of quiet authority, her gaze scanning the situation before settling on Olivia. Sarah immediately spoke up. "This passenger isn't supposed to be in first class," she said quickly, waving toward Olivia. "I was just trying to correct the mistake." The manager didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned to James and took the boarding pass from his hands. She glanced at the name, and then she froze. For a split second, her face went completely pale. Sarah frowned. "What is it?" she asked. The manager didn't answer. Instead, she quickly pulled Sarah aside, whispering something urgent in her ear. Sarah's face drained of color instantly. Her entire posture changed. Her shoulders stiffened and her hands twitched slightly as if she were suddenly aware of the way she had been carrying herself. Olivia remained silent, watching. She didn't need to say a word. The truth had finally caught up to them. The flight manager inhaled sharply, keeping her voice low as she spoke to Sarah. But the words were clear enough that Olivia could hear them. "She's Olivia Carter, the CEO of this airline." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Her entire body went rigid, her hands clutching at the hem of her uniform. Passengers around them stirred, murmurs spreading like wildfire. A businessman in the front row let out a low whistle. "Wait, she's the CEO?" A woman across the aisle who had been watching the confrontation unfold gasped audibly. Others turned to each other in disbelief. A few passengers pulled out, their phones recording the moment. Sarah took a small step back. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her mind racing for an explanation. Any explanation. I didn't know," she finally stammered, her voice weak, almost desperate. Olivia, still seated, didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, her fingers calmly resting on the armrest. She let the silence stretch between them before she finally spoke. "You didn't want to know." Sarah's face drained of color. Passengers shifted in their seats, exchanging uncomfortable glances. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Some of the flight crew exchanged embarrassed looks, realizing the depth of the mistake that had just been made. A young attendant at the back of the cabin covered her mouth with her hand, shaking her head in disbelief. And then, a loud click, a journalist seated a few rows away had captured the moment on camera. The flash from his phone screen briefly illuminated the scene. This moment, Sarah's downfall, was now documented. The flight manager's expression darkened. She turned to Sarah, her voice sharp and final. "You're relieved of duty, immediately." Sarah flinched as though she had been struck. Wait," she stuttered. "I didn't mean—" The manager's voice was firm, unwavering. "Security will escort you off the plane." A deep, heavy silence filled the cabin. Sarah stood there, frozen, as if she hadn't fully processed what was happening. But as two security personnel approached from the entrance of the aircraft, she realized it was over. Passengers watched as Sarah, the once confident, arrogant flight attendant, was led away. She walked stiffly, her back straight, but her face was pale. Her jaw clenched tightly as she struggled to maintain whatever dignity she had left. No one clapped. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the jet engines and the faint rustling of pages as Olivia casually picked up her magazine again. She exhaled slowly, finally letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. As Sarah was led away, the silence in the cabin remained heavy. The passengers who had been whispering before now sat quietly, their gazes shifting between Olivia and the empty space where the flight attendant had just stood. Olivia let out a slow breath and then, for the first time since the confrontation had begun, she stood up. She turned to face the first-class cabin, her expression calm but resolute. "Let this be a lesson," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "Never assume who belongs where." A few passengers nodded in agreement, their expression shifting from awkward guilt to quiet understanding. Some looked down, avoiding eye contact, their discomfort evident. Others sat in stunned reflection, perhaps recalling times they had witnessed, or participated in, similar moments of bias. The weight of her words hung in the air. She didn't need to say anything else. The message had already been received. She picked up her bag, adjusted her sweater, and gracefully took her seat again. She had no interest in grand speeches or long explanations. The truth had already done all the work. By the time the flight landed in Los Angeles, the entire world was watching. The journalist who had captured the moment on camera published the footage within minutes. It didn't take long for it to spread across social media, picking up traction with every passing second. "Respect all passengers" began trending worldwide. News outlets picked up the story, highlighting the importance of fighting bias in luxury spaces. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences of discrimination, discussing how assumptions, both big and small, still dictated how people were treated, even in spaces they had rightfully earned. Comment sections filled with outrage, support, and reflection. Why are we still dealing with things like this in 2025? Imagine humiliating someone, only to find out they're your boss. This isn't just about one flight. This happens everywhere. Some people, seeing Olivia's calm response, felt inspired. Others, witnessing Sarah's humiliating downfall, felt a much-needed wake-up call. As the story gained attention, Skylux Airlines had no choice but to respond. The company issued a formal statement the next morning, which was broadcasted across multiple news outlets and posted on their official accounts. "At Skylux Airlines, we do not tolerate discrimination, in any form, no matter who it's from. The actions of the flight attendant in question do not reflect our values, and immediate corrective action has been taken. Moving forward, we are implementing enhanced training programs to ensure that every passenger is treated with dignity and respect." The words were clear. Sarah was done. She had spent years believing she held power over passengers, believing she could determine who belonged where. But now, her name was associated with a global controversy. The airline cut ties with her immediately. Other airlines, seeing the backlash, quietly distanced themselves from her. Her once sterling career in the airline industry? Finished. Assumptions had cost her everything. But the story didn't just end with Sarah's firing. It sparked something bigger. Olivia's actions, her patience, her dignity, her quiet yet firm response became a symbol of resilience and power. She didn't fight with anger. She fought with the truth, and in doing so, she inspired thousands. Conversations about racial bias, privilege, and assumptions in high-end spaces flooded online discussions. People in corporate offices, luxury brands, airlines, and hospitality industries began reflecting on their own policies and training procedures. People started to ask, how many times has something like this happened without cameras around? How many passengers have been humiliated and had no way to fight back? How many times have we seen discrimination and stayed silent? The impact of Olivia's moment extended far beyond a single flight. It became a movement. As the plane taxied to the gate, Olivia checked her phone. The messages poured in, some from colleagues, some from strangers, some from young black professionals who saw her as an inspiration. She didn't reply to any of them. Not yet. She simply put her phone on silent, exhaled, and waited for the doors to open. She had won, but not because she was the CEO. She had won because she never needed to prove anything in the first place. And the world finally saw that. As Olivia stepped off the plane, the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air. The world had seen the truth, and the consequences had been swift. Sarah had made a choice based on an assumption, and it had cost her everything. Judging someone by their appearance won't just cost you respect, it can cost you everything. The impact of this moment went far beyond one flight. It was a reminder of how often people are judged before they are even given a chance. It was a story about power, privilege, and the dangers of making assumptions. Now, we want to hear from you. What would you have done in Olivia's place? Would you have spoken up immediately? Would you have let the truth unfold just as she did? Let us know in the comments. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that challenge assumptions and spark change. Your voice matters, and together, we can help bring awareness to the issues that need to be addressed. And this is just the beginning. Stay tuned for another inspiring tale coming soon, because the fight for justice, respect, and equality never stops.